Today's podcast is going to be very direct and it's going to cover emergency funds. And I know a lot of you guys have these questions. And so I want to make sure this is a very, very simple, straightforward video with a full tool below in the show notes for you, and you can actually use this and get the answer. So first things first, I want to discuss what an emergency fund is, because I think fundamentally people don't actually understand what an emergency fund is. It literally is as it sounds, for an emergency. And I know that sounds basic, but I don't think people know how to actually set themselves up so that they can utilize it when an emergency happens. Emergencies are going to happen, guys. That's part of life. We've had quite a number of emergencies over the years, and you're going to have them too. And the thing is, they won't feel as bad if you're prepared for them. And so that's the purpose of this fund. It is cash set aside in case something happens that's irregular. And so that irregular activity, let's say it's a $2,000 expense out of nowhere, you can take the $2,000 in that emergency fund and you can fund that without taking away from all of the other stuff that's going on in your financial plan over here. So it's a way to basically plug the hole as fast as possible without losing ground. And that's all this comes down to. Now, where do you hold it? How much do you want to put in it? All that kind of stuff. So I typically talk about 3 banks. And again, this is not limited to these banks. And people stress about the silly questions. This isn't going to make much of a difference anyway. For the record, I use Ally Bank, but you also can use Marcus by Goldman Sachs, or I'll provide you a link below for CIT Bank. They all work. They're all great. And if you understand fundamentally how the rates are decided with a high yield savings account, they're based on what the Fed does. So as the Fed's moving rates up and down, these banks have to shift with the times, and then they're going to compete on top of that. So all in all, they're going to move up and down with the rates, and they're all going to be in competition, meaning the difference between these banks are going to be so negligible with the amounts that you have in here. It won't make sense to really waste your time on this question. We're talking less than $100 per year type of question you're asking yourself right now, and you're focused on the wrong stuff if you think that's going to move the needle. If anything, you should ideally focus on how much cash ideally is in this account, because if you have too much, you're going to cost yourself an opportunity cost more by leaving cash sitting there versus what you could do with it otherwise. So let's focus on the actual amount. Typically, what I say is 3 to 6 months of expenses. Where did I get that from? That's a very fundamentally accepted principle out there. I did not make that up. However, here's what we want to think about is the level of risk you and your family have. So if I'm an individual and I'm single and I have one income and I'm perfectly healthy and there is no potential risk of job loss, I just got my career and I have a very up and coming promising career. I don't think there's going to be anything regarding a job loss, but I don't have any health issues, but there could be something. I'm probably not going to have a high risk type of situation in that example. And therefore, I might lean to a lesser emergency fund, like 3 months. But what if I have my situation, as you guys know, a daughter with special needs that requires a lot of medical requirements out of nowhere in one income, and a spouse that stays at home? I want to lean towards that 6-month emergency fund, because I don't know what could happen if Logan has a medical need and it's $15,000 out of nowhere. I need to make sure I'm covered for that situation. So a base rule of thumb is monthly expenses times 3 to 6 months, but some people go upward of 12 months. I think there is a level that you go too far with for a lot of people. And I also think as a premise of the emergency fund not being a wealth builder. And so when people stop thinking of it as a wealth builder, they realize they're going to put the bare minimum to cover their emergency, and then they'll put their other money in the stock market or real estate or actual wealth building vehicles, which is where you should be putting it. So when I think about this from a holistic standpoint, from top to bottom, number one, I want to make sure my bills are being paid on time. Then I want to make sure I have 1 to 2 months of cash in my checking account, because I want to make sure my bills month to month, with the mortgage coming out on the 1st and the car payment coming out on the 7th, et cetera, that flow isn't going to put me in a deficit. I want to make sure that is a buffer sitting in my checking account, and then all my income that comes into the given month should be allocated somewhere. So it should be allocated to all my expenses, and then everything over and above that should go to my savings and investments, right? And so once I set that aside, that is fixed. That's guaranteed every single month. And so I had that process rolling. But let's say I have an emergency that pops up. Let's say it's $2,000. Let's say I'm making $7,000. I have $5,000 of expenses and I invest $2,000. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, a $2,000 expense pops up. How is that covered? That is when the emergency fund, you would take and pull that $2,000 from that big pile of cash that you have. You would then go pay for that emergency, and then you would adjust your finances going forward to take a portion of that $2,000 being invested and put and refill that emergency fund bucket and then get back to business. And so that's how you want to handle your finances when it comes to an emergency. I'm going to show you an example of an emergency readiness calculator. So a lot of people can't get to this actual number, or they make things way too complicated. If you don't know your monthly expenses, I'm not saying napkin math here. I'm talking true monthly expenses of what you spend every single month, reality, not just your theory in your brain. You should know specifically what that number is. And then you can then do the calculation and based on your level of risk. If you're more risky, go upward of 6. If you're less risky, go downward of 3. But once we're there, we set that aside and that sits there untouched in a high yield savings account like we talked about. You do not want to do anything else with that specific money besides an emergency. So you don't negotiate with yourself that sometimes I can cover my, overage in my checking account, or I'm going to go blow this on a vacation. We aren't negotiating. This is an emergency fund for emergency purposes only. And if we have other goals, vacations, house projects, stuff like that, we want to create a sinking fund that's separate from an emergency fund and build that slow and steady so we have enough money for whatever said project. So in the show notes below, I'm going to give you an emergency fund calculator. And so how this looks is there's going to be a current savings. And again, that's how much you have saved up currently. So in this example, I use $5,000. Then we talk about how much are you saving per month. I put $250 just to show you an illustration here. And then what are your monthly household expenses? I put $7,500. That's assuming you truly know that. You're not just making that up. And then it says, what is your actual target for your emergency fund? And I say 6 months here. So based on that calculation, I hit calculate your timeline and it shows me 11%, which is well below what I need. And as you see, the readiness is 11%. The target fund is 45,000, which is 7,500 times 6. That's how I'm getting to that number. And then you see your current savings is 5,000, meaning I have to save $40,000 difference. So 45,000 minus 5,000 currently have. My monthly savings is $250 per month based on what I inputted. So based on that, the red box pops up for good reason because that's going to take 160 months to cover a $40,000 emergency fund. So if you look at it, $250 times 160 months would equal $40,000 to fill that gap. So obviously that's an illustration to show you how long it could be. But again, it shouldn't look like that if you understand the fundamentals of finance. And if you don't, go in the show notes below and book a call with my team to elevate your finances once and for all and be done with it. You'll work with me and my team. You'll get one-on-one access and we will build you out an entire financial roadmap that covers everything in your personal finances. So it is a no-brainer to go do that. In the show notes below, you can book a free call with my team. But with that being said, if your number does show that you're short, we have to understand how much that is, and then we have to pause everything after that. So again, the whole purpose of the emergency fund is to fill the hole on the ship that has the leaking water. And so if I can't fix that, I can't be investing, I can't have a 401k, I can't have a taxable brokerage, I can't be paying off a bunch of debt. I need to be focused on covering my emergency fund, because what if you're doing all of that other stuff, but you don't have an emergency fund and an emergency pops up? It might not feel like it's going to, but at some point it will, I guarantee it. And lastly, I'm going to give you a real life example of our situation. So when we moved to Texas, we bought a house down here in a perfect neighborhood and we loved it. And we thought nothing was wrong with it. It was brand new, 2019 at the time. We moved in 2022. So it was like 3 years old, one previous owner. And when we bought it, there was no signs of mold or mycotoxins, which we found out was a significant issue down the road. But in Texas and also in high humid states, a lot of this stuff actually starts in the HVAC, which we've come to learn. And I'm an HVAC expert, unfortunately, now because of all the stuff that happened. So with that being said, it was brewing in our HVAC and we had no idea. And yes, we had regular replacements. Yes, we had filter changes. Yes, we took care of our HVAC. But because the condensation, the way the homes are built energy tight, and also the way that Texas HVAC systems are built in these houses, it's very common for this to happen. But again, we were new residents. We didn't know. We also have a special needs daughter that cannot have any neurotoxins, which mycotoxins are neurotoxins because there's a neurological disorder. Not to mention our general health was actually falling as well. And we didn't even know until my daughter got some tests done and we figured out what that issue was. Now, once we did that, we realized we could not live in our house and we had to instantly move out of our house. And so we had to find temporary living, then go buy a new house, then remediate our house, and then sell our house. That took a long time, like a 3 to 4 month period. And so what happens when you lose a house in stability? You eat out more, you have a lot of expenses that aren't typical, you have remediation cost, you have a new home down payment, you have a lot of these expenses that pile up quickly. And what happened is because we also lost everything in the house due to the mold and mycotoxins and we could not have that or bring that with us, we spent $300,000 with this emergency. That was unexpected. That did not cover our 3 to 6 months of expenses that we had. So how do we handle that? So we have a basic emergency fund handled, but this is where higher level financial planning comes into play. So because we had a lot of liquid investments in our brokerage account, we basically could cash flow everything that came at us at this point. But it's because we built our emergency fund early on. We took care of all of the other financial avenues, one of those being a taxable brokerage account, and we became extremely liquid with that account to where we could withdraw it if we ever needed it. We have near $2 million in an account, so it wasn't that scary to be like, hey, we need 300,000 from this ASAP to take care of all these issues. And plus we had earned income coming in the door as well. So we had other things happening too, because the emergency wasn't loss of job, it was literally loss of house. So sometimes the actual emergency doesn't play out like you would expect it to, and you have to be prepared for that. Not to mention, since 2022, we've had over $200,000 in medical billings every single year. Although while insurance does cover a lot of that, there's a lot of out-of-pocket costs to where we probably are averaging nearly $50,000 a year at a bare minimum to take care of those special needs. And so that is another cost that we kind of build in our expectation more so than our emergency. But again, we don't plan or we don't want to spend that unless something happens like an emergency to some extent. So this conversation is direct. It is 3 to 6 months. It is in a high yield savings account. However, there are other things you need to consider when you're doing this. So again, the free resource is in my show notes below. And you can also book a call with my team if you're smart to upgrade your financial life once and for all and take this to the next level, to be financially free, to live the life that I talk about all the time. I live and breathe this stuff, and I would love to help you, and I appreciate you, and I will see you guys all next Monday. Budget dog.